A doctor performs the first head transplant. Things go wrong. Be ready for a story that you will never forget. I was a doctor, and I had always been fascinated by the idea of head transplants. The thought of being able to give someone a new body, a new lease on life, was something that had always intrigued me. So when I was approached by a patient who was suffering from a debilitating disease and was willing, the patient, a man in his 30s, was eager to undergo the procedure. He had been suffering from his disease for years, and he was ready for a change. I had spent months preparing for the surgery, studying every detail of the procedure and making sure that everything was in place. Finally, the day of the surgery arrived. We had assembled a team of the best doctors and nurses in the world, and we were ready to make history. The patient was prepped and ready to go, and I began the delicate process of removing his head from his body. The surgery was going smoothly, and I was confident that we were going to be successful. But then, something went wrong. As I was attaching the patient's head to his new body, I noticed that his vital signs were dropping rapidly. I tried to stabilize him, but it was too late. The patient had died on. I was devastated. I had spent so much time and effort preparing for this surgery, and now it had all been for nothing. But then, something strange happened. The patient's head began to move. At first, I thought it was just a reflex, but then I realized that he was conscious. I couldn't believe it. The patient was alive, but he was trapped in a body that wasn't his own. He was in pain, and he was scared. I tried to comfort him, but there was nothing I could do. I had created a monster. The patient's new body was rejecting his head, and he was slowly dying. I tried everything I could think of to save him, but it was no use. In the end, I had to watch as he died a slow and painful death. The experience was traumatic, and it haunted me for years. I had thought that I was doing something good, something that would change the world, but instead, I had created a nightmare. I had played God, and I had failed. Years later, I still think about that surgery. I wonder what would have happened if I had been more careful, if I had taken more time to prepare. But I know that it's too late now. The patient is gone, and I can never undo what I did. In the end, I learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, the things we think are good can turn out to be our worst nightmares, and sometimes, it's better to leave well enough alone. I continued to be haunted by the events of that day. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done something terribly wrong. I tried to move on with my life, but the guilt was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Months went by, and I tried to forget about the failed head transplant. But then, something strange began to happen. I started to hear rumors about a man who had been seen wandering the streets. At night, he was said to be disfigured, with a body that didn't quite match his head. At first, I didn't believe the rumors, but then, I saw him for myself. It was the patient from the failed head transplant. He was alive, but he was no longer human. His body had twisted and contorted, and his head was barely attached to his neck. I tried to approach him, to help him, but he was beyond help. He was in pain, and he was angry. He blamed me for what had happened to him, and he wanted revenge. I tried to run, but he was too fast. He chased me through the streets, his twisted body moving with unnatural speed. I could hear his labored breathing behind me, and I knew that he was getting closer. Finally, I reached my house and slammed the door shut behind me. I thought I was safe, but then I heard a scratching at the door. He was trying to get in. I knew that I had to do something, so I grabbed a knife and prepared to defend myself. But when I opened the door, he was gone. He had disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with my fear. From that day on, I knew that I could never escape the consequences of my actions. The failed head transplant had created a monster, and I was responsible for it. The story continued, and I knew that it would haunt me for the rest of my life. As time went on, the failed head transplant became a distant memory. I had moved on with my life, and I had even started a family. But then, something strange began to happen. People in the town started to disappear, one by one. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then, I started to notice a pattern. All of the people who had disappeared had one thing in common. They had all been involved in the failed head transplant. I knew that I had to do something. I couldn't let this continue. So I started to investigate. I went back to the lab where the surgery had taken place, and I started to look for clues. What I found was horrifying. The patient's body had been preserved, and it had been hooked up to a machine that was keeping it alive. But that wasn't the worst part. The patient's head had been removed, and it had been attached to a new body. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The patient was alive, but he was no longer human. He had become a monster, a creature that was neither alive nor dead. I knew that I had to stop him. I had created this monster, and it was my responsibility to destroy it. So I gathered a team of scientists and doctors, and we set out to find the patient. It wasn't easy, but we finally tracked him down. He was living in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. We approached him cautiously, but he didn't seem to notice us. As we got closer, we realized why. The patient was hooked up to a machine that was keeping him alive, but he was no longer conscious. He was trapped in a body that wasn't his own, and he was suffering. We knew what we had to do. We had to end his suffering, once and for all. So we shut off the machine, and the patient died. It was a bittersweet victory. We had put an end to the monster that I had created, but at what cost? I knew that I could never undo what I had done, but I could try to make amends. So I dedicated the rest of my life to helping others. I became an advocate for organ donation, and I worked tirelessly to make sure that no one else would have to suffer the way that the patient had. In the end, I knew that I could never fully make up for what I had done, but I could try to make the world a better place, one person at a time.